The Mind Control Murders. Inspector George Cream paced the length of his office, his polished shoes tapping against the wooden floor like an ominous metronome. His sharp eyes darted to the clock on the wall every few seconds. 2 whole days had passed since Dora, his wife and one of the sharpest detectives in his department, had disappeared. The unease in the air was thick, making it hard to breathe. "Dora's been missing for 2 days," he muttered under his breath, the words heavier each time they left his lips. He had said them so many times they felt like a mantra, a chant meant to ward off his growing fear. But the fear remained. A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his spiral. P.C. Henry stepped in, his notebook clutched tightly in one hand and his expression grim. "Sir, we've interrogated Mr. Remy," Henry began, his voice low and steady. He was the last person to see her. George spun around, his brow furrowing. "And what did he say?" His voice betrayed his usual calm authority, replaced by a desperate edge. Henry hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to present the information. He said he doesn't remember much. Claims he suddenly felt very sleepy while they were at the castle. The last thing he recalls is Dora screaming, "Inspector! Inspector!" George repeated, his sharp mind already turning over the implications. Was she calling for me? Or him? "I asked myself the same thing, sir," Henry admitted, glancing down at his notes. "But why would she call her husband Inspector? It doesn't make sense." George said, "Of course, she wouldn't. She only calls me that at work, and I wasn't anywhere near the old castle. It must have been Remy she was calling for. He used to be an inspector, after all." Henry shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think someone attacked him? He said he passed out." "Maybe Dora." George cut him off. "Someone must have knocked him unconscious," he said firmly. "And whoever it was likely dragged Dora away. She wouldn't just vanish without a fight. Not Dora." Henry's gaze flicked to the floor, and for a moment, he looked like a schoolboy caught not doing his homework. "Should we have checked the castle sooner, sir?" George sighed heavily. "We've been spread too thin, Henry. The diamond case has everyone scrambling. Dora was there to check if the stones were hidden at the castle. Now she's missing, and we have no idea where to start." Henry cleared his throat, breaking the silence that followed. "Are you free now, sir? We could head there together." George shook his head. "I'll go." "You've got the stolen bicycle case, don't you?" Yes, sir." Henry gave a half-hearted salute and retreated, leaving George alone with his thoughts once more. The inspector stared out of his office window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the city below. He couldn't just sit here. Dora was more than his wife, she was his partner, his equal. If he didn't act now, every passing moment might widen the gap between them, making her harder to find. Grabbing his coat and torch, George headed for the castle. The old castle stood at the edge of a cliff, its looming silhouette framed by the dying light of the day. George's breath misted in the cold air as he pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The hinges creaked, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. As he stepped inside, a swarm of bats erupted from the darkness above, their wings flapping chaotically as they fled the disturbance. George ducked instinctively, cursing under his breath. The interior of the castle was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew. A long, dark corridor stretched out before him, lined with ancient wooden doors on either side. George tightened his grip on his torch, the small beam of light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. "Dora," he called, his voice echoing back at him in haunting repetitions. He listened intently, but the only response was the faint drip of water from somewhere deeper in the castle. He pushed open the first door he came to, revealing an empty room filled with cobwebs and broken furniture. Room after room, the scene repeated itself, decay, silence, and emptiness. As George reached the end of the corridor, the lights suddenly flickered on, bathing the passage in a harsh, unnatural glow. Startled, George spun around, his hand instinctively going to the small pistol holstered at his side. "You're a little late to the party, George," a voice drawled behind him. George turned slowly, his heart pounding. A man stepped out from the shadows, his face partially obscured by the collar of his coat. George recognized him immediately, an old colleague, someone he hadn't seen in years. "Gregory," George said, his voice laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Gregory smirked, his expression cold and calculated. "Funny how life works, isn't it? If you hadn't solved that case before me, I'd have been the inspector." "Not you." George frowned. "What are you talking about?" Gregory's smile widened, his eyes glinting with malice. "No names, George. Let's keep things professional, shall we? I know why you're here, looking for your wife and those shiny little stones. But you won't find either. Not alive, anyway." The lights flickered out again, plunging the corridor back into darkness. George swung his torch around, but Gregory was gone. "Coward!" George shouted, his voice echoing through the empty passage. "Face me!" A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, stopping George in his tracks. It wasn't human. The sound was primal, raw, and filled with menace. His pulse quickened as he strained his eyes against the dark. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Its form was humanoid, but its eyes glowed like embers, and its teeth gleamed like knives. The creature let out another growl, its claws scraping against the stone floor as it advanced. George's back hit the wall. He fumbled for his gun, but his hands trembled as the creature lunged. Its knife gleamed in the dim torchlight, and before George could react, it was upon him. The last thing he heard was his own scream, echoing through the castle and beyond, carried on the cold wind like a ghostly warning. The interrogation room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent light. P.C. Henry sat across from Mr. Remy, the former inspector, his notebook resting on the table. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, and the ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual. Mr. Remy shifted in his chair, his usually composed demeanor replaced by an edge of nervousness. He rubbed his temples and avoided Henry's sharp gaze. "Let's go over it again, Mr. Remy," Henry began, his tone steady but probing. "You were the last person seen with Dora. You're an ex-inspector, you know how this works. I need the details. Every single one." Remy sighed, his hands clasping and unclasping on the table. "I've told you everything, Henry. It's all a blur." "Blur or not," Henry pressed, leaning forward slightly, "you were there. You're the only person who can help us piece together what happened." Remy nodded reluctantly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of guilt. "We went to the castle," he began, his voice low. "Dora thought it might be worth checking for the diamonds. You know, the ones that went missing." Henry nodded, urging him to continue without interrupting. "I didn't think we'd find anything, honestly. That place has been abandoned for decades. But Dora insisted, and well, you don't argue with someone like her." A small, wistful smile flickered across Remy's face before disappearing. "We walked through the main hall, looking for any signs of hiding places. It was cold, damp, eerie." Henry scribbled notes furiously, his pen scratching against the paper. And then, Remy hesitated, his brow furrowing as if the effort of recalling the events physically pained him. "I started to feel off. My head got heavy, my vision blurred. It was like I was being pulled under a thick wave of exhaustion. I remember leaning against the wall, trying to stay awake." Henry's pen paused mid-word. "What do you mean by off? Did you smell anything unusual? See anyone else there?" Remy shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "No. That's just it. Nothing made sense. One moment I was fine, and the next I could barely keep my eyes open. Henry tapped his pen against the notebook, his expression thoughtful. And Dora? What was she doing when this started? She was a few steps ahead, Remy said, his gaze distant, as if replaying the scene in his mind. She turned back to look at me, and that's when it happened. What happened? Henry asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if the weight of the question demanded silence. Remy's hands clenched into fists on the table. She screamed. Henry froze. Screamed? What did she say? She shouted, Inspector. Remy said, his voice trembling. It echoed through the hall. I remember trying to move, to go to her, but my legs wouldn't work. Everything went black after that. Henry's eyes narrowed. Inspector, you say? Was she calling for you? Remy hesitated, his face pale under the harsh lighting. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe she was calling for George. Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Remy's face. You don't know. You were standing right there, man. I was half conscious. Remy snapped, slamming his hands on the table. Do you think I haven't been asking myself the same damn question? Do you think I don't feel responsible for what happened to her? Henry regarded him in silence for a moment, letting the tension simmer. All right, he said finally, his tone softer but still probing. So you blacked out. What happened when you woke up? Remy exhaled shakily, running a hand through his graying hair. I woke up on the floor, hours later. My head was pounding, and my clothes were covered in dust. Dora was gone. I called out for her, searched the castle as best as I could in my state, but there was no sign of her. I thought maybe she'd gone back to the station. But she didn't, Henry said bluntly. And you didn't think to report this immediately? I was disoriented. Remy snapped, his frustration boiling over. And ashamed. I was supposed to have her back. I'm the one who insisted on going with her, and I failed. Henry studied him, his pen tapping against the edge of the notebook. Mr. Remy, do you think someone might have drugged you? Or, I don't know, hypnotized you? Remy's head shot up, his eyes narrowing. Hypnotized? What on earth are you talking about? I know it sounds far-fetched, Henry admitted, but it's not impossible. You've been in this line of work long enough to know that strange things happen. Remy scoffed but didn't entirely dismiss the idea. If someone did that to me, they're damn good at covering their tracks. I didn't see or hear a thing. Henry nodded slowly, jotting down a final note. All right, Mr. Remy. That's all for now. But if you remember anything else, anything at all, you come to me immediately. Understood? Remy nodded, his shoulders slumping as he stood. I want to find her as much as you do, Henry. Maybe more. As Remy left the room, Henry remained seated, flipping back through his notes. The story felt incomplete, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Inspector, he murmured to himself. Was she calling for help, or was she warning someone? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Inspector George Cream stood in his office, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the room. He ran a hand through his thick, graying hair, his mind replaying P.C. Henry's words like a broken record. Why would she call out, Inspector, to Mr. Remy? Henry had asked earlier, his voice tinged with doubt. The question gnawed at Cream, but he shook his head firmly. No, Dora wasn't calling for him. She had no reason to. His wife, a sharp and headstrong detective, would have known better than to shout for help if she thought he wasn't nearby. Dora's smarter than that, he muttered under his breath. Yet, the mystery of her scream, and the cryptic circumstances of her disappearance, pulled at the edges of his resolve. He glanced at his coat hanging by the door, then at the photograph of Dora on his desk. Her bright eyes and determined smile stared back at him, and something stirred in his chest. If no one else could piece this together, he would. Grabbing his coat and flashlight, Cream made up his mind. It was time to go to Clifftop Castle. The drive to the castle was as eerie as Cream had expected. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a dark canvas streaked with the faint glow of moonlight. The winding road was flanked by thick woods, their bare branches scratching against each other in the night breeze. As he parked his car near the castle's crumbling gates, he took a deep breath. The structure loomed before him, its towering stone walls darkened with age and vines. It was a monument of shadows and silence, the kind of place that belonged in ghost stories rather than police investigations. Cream switched on his flashlight and stepped forward. The gates creaked loudly as he pushed them open, the sound echoing in the stillness. "Dora," he whispered to himself, the name almost lost to the night. "Where are you?" The castle's massive wooden doors resisted his push at first, then groaned open with an ominous crack. As he stepped inside, a swarm of bats burst from the rafters above, their wings flapping frantically. Cream yelped, stumbling backward as his flashlight beam darted across the grand hall. "Get a grip, George," he muttered, steadying himself. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp stone and mildew. His flashlight illuminated the dusty floor, revealing scattered debris and the faint impressions of footprints. He knelt to examine them, two sets, one larger than the other. "Dora and Remy," he murmured, his mind racing. The prints led further into the castle, disappearing into the yawning darkness of a narrow corridor. He followed cautiously, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The corridor stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with doors lining either side. Each door seemed to lead into nothingness, their cracked wood and rusted hinges whispering tales of abandonment. Cream paused in front of one particularly large door, the edges stained with something dark, perhaps water, perhaps something worse. He hesitated, his fingers brushing against the handle. A sudden noise made him freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, a low growl, guttural and menacing, like the sound of a predator stalking its prey. Cream's heart thudded in his chest as he swung the flashlight beam wildly down the hall. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm but edged with unease. Silence. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty save for a few broken chairs and a thick layer of dust. But something caught his eye, a glint of metal on the far side of the room. He stepped closer and found a small brooch lying on the floor. Dora's brooch. "Damn it," he whispered, clutching it tightly. The realization that she had been here, and had left behind something so personal, made his stomach churn. Was she trying to leave a clue? Or had it fallen during a struggle? The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. Cream turned sharply, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. At the end of the corridor stood a figure. At first, it was hard to tell if it was a man or an animal. It crouched low, its features obscured by shadow. But its eyes glinted, two piercing, unnatural orbs that seemed to bore into Cream's very soul. "Show yourself," Cream demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. The figure straightened, revealing the unmistakable shape of a man. But there was something wrong about him, his movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, and his lips curled into a sinister grin. Well, Inspector Cream," the man drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "Fancy meeting you here." "Who are you?" Cream barked, his flashlight shaking slightly as he aimed it at the man. "Does it matter?" the man replied, stepping into the light. His face was unfamiliar but his demeanor sent a chill down Cream's spine. "You're here for your wife, aren't you? And the diamonds?" Cream's heart skipped a beat. "Where is she? What have you done with her?" The man chuckled darkly. "Oh, she's here. But you won't find her. No, you'll be joining her soon enough." Before Cream could respond, the lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging everything into pitch blackness. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely. Damn it! Cream hissed, fumbling with the flashlight. The growl returned, closer now, and this time accompanied by the sound of footsteps, quick, deliberate, and heading straight for him. Cream backed away, his hands instinctively reaching for the wall behind him. "Whoever you are, stay back," he shouted, his voice bouncing off the oppressive darkness. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Cream's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "Inspector." It wasn't the man's voice this time. It was softer, weaker, and achingly familiar. Dora's voice. Cream's blood ran cold. "Dora," he called out, his voice cracking. "Dora, is that you?" But there was no response, only the growl, now louder than ever. And then it lunged. The oppressive darkness of Clifftop Castle seemed to thicken around Inspector George Cream as he cautiously moved through its cold, labyrinthine corridors. The air carried an eerie stillness, interrupted only by the crunch of his boots against the gritty floor. His flashlight beam wavered over cobweb-laden walls, the shadows contorting into sinister shapes that seemed to move in the corners of his vision. Then, he heard it, a faint, deliberate creak, as if someone or something had shifted weight nearby. His pulse quickened. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice strong despite the chill running down his spine. For a moment, silence was his only reply. But just as he was about to dismiss the sound as a trick of the old building, the lights in the hallway flickered and, with a sharp buzz, burst to life. Cream shielded his eyes against the sudden brightness and turned to see a man standing at the other end of the corridor. The stranger was tall and lean, his features obscured by the shadows that seemed to cling to him despite the glowing lights. His suit was immaculately tailored, but his face carried a smirk that reeked of malice. "Well, well," the man said in a smooth, mocking tone. "Inspector George Cream. The hero of the department. The golden boy. How delightful to see you, here of all places." Cream narrowed his eyes, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "And who exactly are you? What are you doing in this castle?" The man took a step forward, slow and deliberate, the sound of his shoes echoing ominously. "Ah, you don't recognize me, do you? Typical. I suppose it's easy to forget the faces of those you've bested on your way to the top." Cream frowned. "If you've got something to say, say it. I don't have time for cryptic nonsense. My wife is missing, and I intend to find her." "Dora," the man said softly, his smirk widening into a grin. "Yes, I know all about her. And the diamonds. You've come for them, haven't you? How noble. How predictable." Something about the way he said Dora's name sent a shiver through Cream. "What do you know about my wife? Tell me where she is," he demanded, stepping closer. The man chuckled, a low, hollow sound. "Oh, Inspector, always so eager to charge ahead. But do you really want to know the truth? Do you really think you're ready to face what lies ahead?" Cream's patience snapped. "Enough games," he bellowed, his voice reverberating off the stone walls. "If you've harmed her." "Harmed her?" The man tilted his head, feigning innocence. "Not me. I would never dirty my hands with such work. But I can assure you, she's nearby. Closer than you think. And soon, you'll be joining her." Before Cream could respond, the lights flickered again, then plunged the corridor into total darkness. "Damn it," he cursed, twisting the flashlight's head to try and reignite its beam. The mechanism whined, but the light refused to return. "Show yourself," he shouted into the blackness. His demand was met with a sound that made his blood run cold, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something far worse. Cream's breath quickened as he scanned the shadows, his fingers twitching for a weapon he didn't have. "This isn't funny," he said, though his voice wavered. "If you think you can scare me, you're wasting your The growl came again, louder and closer. Cream's heart pounded as he turned toward the source, only to see two glowing eyes staring at him from the void. They were bright, unblinking, and filled with a primal fury that froze him in place. "What in the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature emerged slowly from the shadows, its form monstrous and grotesque. It moved on all fours, its sinewy limbs rippling with unnatural strength. Its maw was lined with jagged teeth, and as it opened its mouth, drool dripped onto the floor with a hiss, as if the creature's very saliva was acidic. Cream staggered back, his foot catching on a loose stone. He hit the wall with a thud, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The creature advanced, its growl rumbling like an earthquake, vibrating through Cream's bones. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The creature stopped a few feet from him, its glowing eyes narrowing as if savoring his terror. Then, without warning, it lunged. Cream screamed as the beast hurtled toward him, its claws outstretched. He dropped to the ground in a desperate attempt to dodge, but he felt a searing pain as one of its claws raked across his shoulder. The impact sent him sprawling, his head striking the cold stone floor. Dazed and bleeding, Cream tried to push himself up, but the creature was already on him. Its foul breath washed over him as it growled, its teeth snapping dangerously close to his face. "Dora!" Cream shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Dora, if you can hear me." The beast roared, drowning out his words. It raised a claw, poised to strike the final blow. Cream shut his eyes, bracing for the end. Suddenly, the sound of his scream tore through the castle like a thunderclap, reverberating into the night and echoing for miles. And then, just as suddenly, there was silence. The corridor was empty once more, save for the faint, eerie whisper of the wind through the castle walls. George Cream was gone. The next morning, the news of Inspector George Cream's mysterious disappearance spread like wildfire through the station. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their faces pale with disbelief. Sitting in Cream's office, Mr. Remy, the former inspector, leaned forward in the creaking chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. His eyes, though shadowed with fatigue, carried a strange intensity as if he were wrestling with something far beyond his comprehension. "Inspector Cream's disappearance cannot go unanswered," Remy announced, his voice steady but strained. "Until we find him, or someone else steps up, I will assume command." P.C. Henry, who had been standing quietly near the door, frowned. "Mr. Remy, with all due respect, don't you find it odd? First Detective Dora, now Inspector Cream. Both vanish under mysterious circumstances." "Odd is an understatement, Henry," Remy admitted, rubbing his temple. "It feels wrong, deeply wrong. But my focus must be on maintaining order and solving this. We need answers." Henry hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Remy, I know this might sound strange, but, do you remember anything unusual about the last 2 days? Any odd events, feelings, or encounters?" Remy's brow furrowed. He shifted uneasily in the chair. "I've been thinking about that since you interrogated me about Dora. Truth be told, I still can't explain it. The last thing I remember before Dora screamed was feeling incredibly tired, like I'd been drugged. And yesterday," he trailed off, shaking his head. Henry leaned forward, his eyes sharp with curiosity. "What about yesterday?" Remy sighed, his hand brushing over his chin. "I meant to relax at home after the commotion. But when I woke up from a nap, my clothes were dusty. Like I'd been somewhere else entirely. But how? I never left my chair." Henry's eyes widened. "Dusty clothes, heavy sleep, and blank memories, sir, do you think it's possible that you weren't in control of yourself?" Remy gave him a hard look. "What are you suggesting, Henry?" "That I was possessed." "Not possessed," Henry said quickly, though the thought of such a phenomenon sent a chill down his spine. "Hypnotized." Remy blinked, clearly caught off guard. Hypnotized? That's absurd. Is it? Henry pressed, his voice low and deliberate. Think about it. Hypnosis, when done right, can make people do things against their will, things they'd never imagine doing. What if someone is using you as a pawn? What if they've already used you? Remy stared at Henry, the blood draining from his face. You're saying I might have been manipulated into, he stopped, his voice cracking. No. I would never hurt anyone. Not Cream, and certainly not Dora. I believe you, Henry assured him. But think about it. Dora vanished after meeting with you. Then Cream disappears right after. Both times, you were. Stop, Remy interrupted, his voice sharp but trembling. You're making this sound like I'm responsible. Do you know what you're accusing me of? I'm not accusing, Henry replied firmly. I'm investigating. And if I'm right, then you're as much a victim as they are. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Remy leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples again as though the weight of the situation was too much to bear. Let's assume for a moment that you're right, Remy said. What do we do? How do we prove it? Henry hesitated, his mind racing. We need to figure out who's behind this, and why. Whoever it is clearly hates Cream. Maybe even Dora. They're using you because you were close to them both. And they're targeting those closest to Cream. Remy shook his head, his expression anguished. This is madness. But if there's even a chance you're right, we need to act fast. Henry nodded. First things first, we need to protect you. If they've hypnotized you once, they'll do it again. And if that happens, we'll lose any chance of finding out the truth. What do you suggest? Remy asked, his tone uncertain. Henry pulled a small notepad from his pocket and scribbled a note. Meet me at the Armory Museum this evening, he said. We'll find something there to keep you safe. Safe? From what? Remy asked, his voice edged with frustration. From their control, Henry replied. They can only manipulate someone if they don't have any metal on their person. I'll explain more when we meet. For now, just, don't let anyone look you in the eyes for too long. Remy frowned but nodded. I'll be there. As Henry left the room, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but something still didn't sit right. Someone inside their ranks had to be orchestrating this. Someone with intimate knowledge of their team. And Henry had a sinking feeling that he knew exactly who it might be. He stopped abruptly in the hallway as Sergeant Charles stepped into view. Charles was impeccably dressed as always, his posture straight and his expression calm. Henry, Charles greeted, his voice smooth. You seem troubled. Something on your mind? Henry forced a smile, masking the unease bubbling in his chest. Just trying to piece things together. You know how it is. Of course, Charles replied, his tone light but his gaze piercing. Anything I can help with? Not yet, Henry said, taking a step back. But I'll let you know if I need anything. Charles nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. I'll be here. As Henry walked away, his pulse quickened. The way Charles had looked at him, the subtle sharpness in his tone, it was enough to set off alarm bells in Henry's mind. He glanced back over his shoulder to find Charles still watching him, his smile now gone. For the first time since the case began, Henry felt the chilling certainty that he was being hunted too. The night was heavy with an eerie stillness as P.C. Henry stood outside the dimly lit Armory Museum. The moonlight cast long, pale shadows over the cobblestone street, and every sound seemed magnified, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint creak of a lantern swinging in the wind. Henry checked his watch, his breath visible in the crisp air. Where is he? He muttered, scanning the road for signs of Remy. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Remy approached from the other end of the street, his face partially obscured by his hat. He walked stiffly, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "You're late," Henry said, his voice low but sharp. Remy didn't respond immediately. His movements were mechanical, almost as if he were forcing himself to walk. When he finally stopped in front of Henry, his eyes seemed distant, glazed over, like a man lost in a fog. "Sorry," Remy said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "Got held up." Henry frowned, unease prickling at his skin. Something was off, but he couldn't quite place it. "Let's get inside," he said, nodding toward the museum. "We don't have much time." They entered the building, the air inside cool and stale. Henry led the way through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing softly. The armory exhibits loomed around them, ancient swords, tarnished shields, gleaming helmets. Henry had done his research. There was a specific artifact they needed, a small but powerful amulet crafted from meteoric iron. It was rumored to disrupt mental influence, making it the perfect shield against hypnosis. As they approached the display case where the amulet was housed, Henry glanced over his shoulder at Remy. The older man was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Henry with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You all right, Remy?" Henry asked cautiously. Remy blinked, as if coming out of a trance. "Fine," he said, though his voice carried a strange undertone, something cold, almost sinister. Henry turned back to the case, his unease growing. Using a small lockpick he had brought, he carefully pried open the display, reaching in to retrieve the amulet. The cold metal felt reassuring in his hand. "We'll use this to protect you," Henry said, holding up the amulet. "If my theory is right, this should." Before he could finish, he felt a sharp shove from behind, sending him crashing into the glass case. Shards scattered across the floor as he spun around to face his attacker. "Remy!" Henry gasped, his heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing?" Remy's face twisted into a snarl, his eyes devoid of recognition. "You meddle too much, Henry," he growled, his voice unnaturally deep. "It's time to put an end to your interference." Henry's mind raced as he scrambled to his feet. "This isn't you, Remy," he shouted. "You're under their control." Remy lunged at him, his movements quick and animalistic. Henry barely managed to sidestep the attack, clutching the amulet tightly. "Snap out of it," he yelled, dodging another strike. "Fight it, Remy. Fight them." But Remy showed no signs of hearing him. His strength was unnerving, his blows relentless. Henry grabbed a shield from a nearby display and used it to block an incoming punch. The force of the impact reverberated through his arm, nearly knocking him off balance. "Think, Henry, think," he muttered to himself, his mind racing for a solution. He needed to stop Remy without hurting him, but how? Then it hit him. The amulet. If it could protect someone from hypnosis, maybe it could break the control entirely. "Remy!" Henry shouted, ducking another swing. "I'm sorry about this." Before Remy could react, Henry pressed the cold metal of the amulet against his forehead. There was a brief moment of resistance, followed by a sharp, agonized scream. Remy staggered backward, clutching his head as if in pain. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling. "Remy," Henry said cautiously, keeping the amulet at the ready. "Are you?" Remy looked up, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Henry," he gasped, his voice trembling. What just happened?" "You were under their control," Henry said, lowering the amulet slightly but keeping his guard up. "They turned you against me." Remy sank to his knees, his hands shaking. I couldn't stop it. It was like I was trapped in my own body, watching myself do things I didn't want to do." Henry crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault, Remy. Whoever's behind this is playing a dangerous game, and they're using you as a pawn." But we're going to stop them. Together. Remy nodded weakly, his face pale. Thank you, Henry. If you hadn't stopped me. Henry stood, his resolve hardening. We don't have time to dwell on it. We need to figure out who's pulling the strings. And I think I know where to start. Who? Remy asked, struggling to his feet. Sergeant Charles, Henry said, his voice grim. He knew too much about our plans, and his behavior's been off. We need to confront him before he makes his next move. Remy nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. Let's finish this. As they left the museum, the amulet now securely around Remy's neck, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that their battle was far from over. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain, the game was about to take a deadly turn. The air was thick with tension as PC Henry stumbled backward, narrowly dodging another blow from Remy. The older man's eyes were wild, his fists landing with bone-crunching force, a stark contrast to the calm, methodical Inspector Henry knew. His breathing was heavy, ragged, but there was something in Remy's expression, something that made Henry's blood run cold. This wasn't Remy. Not the Remy who had been his mentor. Not the Remy who had shared 1,000 cases and endless cups of coffee. This was someone else, someone who had been twisted and turned into a weapon. Henry's heart hammered in his chest, his mind working frantically to find a way out of this nightmare. The amulet, the one piece of metal that could have broken the hypnosis, was still in his pocket, but there was no time to use it. Remy was closing in, faster now, stronger. A faint glint caught Henry's eye, a discarded metal soda can lying next to the trash bin just a few feet away. It was flimsy, but it would have to do. Desperately, he lunged for it, gripping it tightly in his hand. He had no choice. He had to defend himself. Remy advanced with another growl, and Henry swung the can toward his face, the impact sending a sharp clang through the otherwise silent night. Remy recoiled, blinking in shock, a flash of confusion sweeping over his features. For a brief moment, Henry saw his friend again, the Remy he had known. Remy! Henry shouted, his voice rising in urgency. Fight it. You have to fight it. You're stronger than this. The words seemed to cut through the fog in Remy's mind, and for a moment, his body stiffened, his fists lowering as if he were waking from a trance. But the hypnosis was a cruel master, and the calm didn't last long. Remy's eyes refocused, and the wildness returned. This time, he didn't charge. He simply looked at Henry, his expression darker, colder. I don't want to hurt you, Henry, Remy muttered, his voice laced with struggle. But I can't stop myself. You have to try, Remy. Henry pleaded, stepping back, putting distance between them. He could feel his pulse thudding in his throat. He was running out of time. You've been manipulated. You've been. Before he could finish, the momentary lapse in Remy's aggression ended. With a guttural yell, Remy lunged again, but this time Henry was ready. Holding the can firmly, he aimed a hard swing at Remy's face. The force of the blow sent the older man reeling back again, disoriented, his hands raised to his face as if trying to push away the confusion. Henry wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up, but as Remy's movements slowed once again, Henry saw the briefest flicker of recognition in his eyes. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough. Please, Remy. Henry shouted, his voice strained with desperation. You're still in there. I know you are. It was like a dam breaking. Remy's body trembled, and he staggered backward, his hands dropping to his sides. Henry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know what's happening to me. I've been so afraid. Henry stepped forward slowly, careful not to spook him. You're not alone, Remy, he said, his voice gentler now. We're going to get you out of this. There was a long silence between them, one filled with the weight of what had just happened. Henry didn't know how long Remy could stay free of the hypnosis. But for now, it seemed like they had won this small battle. With a shaky breath, Henry looked toward the street. The station was only a short distance away. There was no time to waste. They had to confront Charles, the one person who had remained suspiciously calm through all of this, the one person Henry had a gut feeling was behind everything. At the station, the mood was heavy. Charles, the senior sergeant, was hunched over a desk, his back to the door. The station was unusually quiet, the sound of typewriters and distant conversations muted in the stillness. Henry and Remy entered the office without a word. Henry's eyes were hard, narrowed as he stared at the back of Charles's head. "Charles," Henry said, his voice steady but tinged with fury. "We need to talk." Charles didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. "About what, Henry?" he said, his voice too calm, too measured. Henry's fists clenched at his sides. He had no patience for this. He had no more time to waste pretending like everything was normal. "About the disappearances," Henry said, his voice low and dangerous. "About Dora. About Cream. About everything that's been happening. I know you're the one behind it all." There was a long pause. Then, slowly, Charles turned around, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his lips. "So, you've figured it out, have you?" he said, his voice no longer hiding the venom beneath. "Impressive." Henry's jaw tightened. "You've been controlling Remy. You've been behind the murders. And now you're hiding, pulling the strings. It's all been you, hasn't it?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "You're not as clever as you think, Henry," he said, his tone casual, almost mocking. "But you are correct. It's been me all along." Henry's blood ran cold as Charles continued, his voice growing more venomous with each word. "You see, I've had a long-standing vendetta against George Cream," Charles confessed, his eyes gleaming with malice. "He stole everything from me. He got the promotion I deserved. He took the woman I loved. And now, with Dora and Remy, I've made sure that they too will pay for the pain he caused me." Henry's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "You're insane," he spat. Charles chuckled darkly. "Insane? No. Just, misunderstood. I've been patient. I've waited for my moment, and now it's here. Cream's gone, Dora's gone, and Remy is mine. Soon, this entire city will be mine. You, Henry, will be nothing but a footnote in my history." Henry's hands trembled with rage. "You'll never get away with this," he growled, taking a step toward Charles. "Oh, I already have," Charles sneered, his eyes gleaming with the twisted satisfaction of someone who knew their victory was close. "You just don't realize it yet." Henry's breath came in sharp bursts as he stared down the man who had orchestrated so much pain and suffering. He knew now that the real fight was only just beginning, and the stakes were higher than he could have imagined. But there was no turning back now. The dimly lit room seemed to close in around Henry as Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of his face. There was no hesitation in the way Charles spoke now, no pretense. His smile was a wicked thing, almost gleeful, as if he were savoring the moment of his inevitable triumph. "I suppose it's time you knew the full truth, Henry," Charles said, his voice laced with a dark satisfaction. "All this, all the madness, the disappearances, the deaths, it was all part of the plan." Henry stood rigid, his mind working quickly, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a cold gust of wind. Every bone in his body screamed that he should run, that he needed to leave before Charles could do any more damage. But his legs wouldn't move. Every step forward felt like an eternity, as if something in the room were holding him captive. "You've been playing everyone like puppets," Henry said, his voice tight with a mix of disbelief and anger. You controlled Remy. You turned him into a weapon. Charles's smile widened, and he nodded slowly. I did. With the power of my technique, I've been able to control Remy, and many others, without them even realizing it. It's called mind-boggling, he said, the words rolling off his tongue with chilling confidence. A simple method. A powerful one. Henry's breath caught. Mind-boggling? Yes, Charles said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes glinting in the low light. It's a special kind of hypnosis. Not like the weak tricks you see on television. This is different. With just the right words, just the right suggestions, I can make someone do anything. Anything at all. And they'll never even know they've been changed. He paused, savoring Henry's stunned expression. At first, it was just little things, commands to steal, to lie, to manipulate. But eventually, I wanted more. I wanted power. Real power. Charles's laugh echoed through the room, unsettling Henry more than he would have thought possible. Remy? He was just the beginning. I used him to get rid of Dora, to get rid of George Cream. They were in my way. So, I made them disappear. Henry's fists clenched involuntarily, his body stiffening with rage. You're telling me you killed them? You hypnotized them into thinking they were doing it themselves. Not just killing them, Charles corrected, his voice taking on an even more sinister tone. I made sure they suffered. Cream was the hardest. He was too clever, too cautious. But with a little help from my mind-boggling techniques. I had him where I wanted him. It was easy, really. It took time, but it was easy. Dora never saw it coming, poor thing. Henry's mind raced, struggling to wrap around the enormity of what Charles was confessing. But one thought rose above the rest: the plan had never been about Remy or even George Cream. It had been about him, all along. You're insane, Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're telling me that you've been planning all of this, just for power. Charles's gaze never wavered, and his smile never faltered. Power is the ultimate goal, Henry. You should know that by now. But you were always going to be my final target. Henry's stomach churned. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as the full weight of Charles's words hit him. He had never suspected it. Not Charles. Not the senior officer he had known for years. But now, it all made sense: the manipulation, the subtle shifts in behavior, the way Charles had seemed to be always one step ahead. But now you've come too close, Charles said, his voice a cold whisper. And I can't let you ruin everything I've worked for. Henry's heart skipped a beat. You're going to kill me, he said, realizing the obvious, the chilling truth. Is that it? You want me dead? Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward Henry. It's more than just killing you, Henry. You're a threat. A big one. The last piece in my perfect plan. You've always been too clever, too determined. So, I'll make sure you're out of the picture permanently. You won't even know it's happening. Before Henry could react, Charles's arm darted out, and Henry barely had time to react as a sharp glint of metal flashed before his eyes. A knife. He barely dodged it, the blade grazing the side of his cheek as it sliced through the air. Henry's pulse thundered in his ears as he stumbled backward, his eyes locked onto Charles's, who was already preparing for another strike. You're insane, Henry repeated, his heart hammering as he scrambled for something, anything, that could help him defend himself. Charles lunged again, the knife now aimed directly for Henry's throat. But Henry wasn't going down without a fight. His instincts kicked in, his body moving on its own. He ducked just in time, the blade missing him by inches, and then, with all the force he could muster, he threw his elbow into Charles's stomach. The impact was enough to knock the wind out of Charles, but not enough to stop him. The older man staggered back but recovered quickly, his eyes wild with fury. You think you can stop me? Charles spat, his lips curling into a snarl. You're nothing, Henry. You're a pawn, and I'll make sure you stay that way. Henry's mind was racing. He had to think fast. He couldn't let Charles get the upper hand. He couldn't die here. Charles came at him again, but this time, Henry was ready. With a quick motion, he grabbed hold of a nearby chair and swung it at Charles, knocking the knife from his hand. The two men struggled, rolling across the floor, but Henry kept fighting, using every ounce of strength he had left to stay alive. You won't win, Charles, Henry grunted through clenched teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Oh, I already have, Charles hissed, his voice growing colder, more vicious. You're just too blind to see it. Henry's eyes darted around, his mind screaming for an escape plan. And then, with a sudden burst of clarity, he saw it. Charles had left himself vulnerable, just for a moment. Henry reached out, grabbing hold of the metal soda can he had discarded earlier. Without a second thought, he slammed it into Charles's face with all the force he could muster. The impact was enough to send Charles crashing to the ground, momentarily stunned. His head hit the floor with a sickening thud. Henry scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking, his heart still pounding in his chest. For the first time, Charles didn't get up. His eyes flickered closed, his body going limp. Henry stood over him, panting, his chest heaving with exhaustion and adrenaline. You're done, Charles, he said, his voice shaking with the weight of everything that had just happened. But even as he spoke, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. No, this was just the beginning of something far darker. And the cost of victory was much higher than he could have ever imagined. Henry's chest heaved as he pressed his back against the cold, stone wall. His breath was ragged, his body aching from the brutal exchange with Charles. He could feel the blood from the gash on his cheek trickling down his neck, but there was no time to focus on the pain. Not now. Not when Charles was so close, still breathing heavily, his eyes glowing with malice and frustration. Charles's breathing was labored, his fists clenched as he advanced on Henry. The knife, still gleaming with fresh intent, was now gripped tightly in his hand, its sharp edge catching the faint light from the overhead bulb. Henry could see the fire in Charles's eyes, the desperation of someone who had been pushed to the edge. Don't think you can win, Henry, Charles hissed, his voice dripping with venom. You can barely stand, let alone fight me. Henry's legs trembled, his muscles sore from the brutal struggle. He was exhausted, he could feel his strength slipping away with each passing second. But his mind was sharp, calculating, watching Charles's every movement like a hawk. He couldn't let himself give in to the exhaustion. Not yet. Charles lunged forward with a terrifying snarl, the knife aimed straight for Henry's stomach. In that split second, Henry's instincts kicked in. His body moved faster than his mind, a lifetime of training kicking in. He sidestepped the blade just in time, his hands finding a nearby chair that had been overturned during the earlier scuffle. With a grunt of effort, Henry swung the chair with all the strength he could muster, smashing it against Charles's side. The impact was like thunder, sending Charles stumbling back, his knife momentarily lost in the chaos. Henry didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, using the chair's broken legs to shove Charles to the ground. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the two men locked in a silent battle of wills. Henry's mind raced. He knew he couldn't overpower Charles with sheer strength. The man was bigger, stronger, and more experienced in hand-to-hand combat. Henry's only advantage was his resourcefulness, his ability to think in the heat of the moment. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could turn the tide in his favor. His gaze fell on the metal filing cabinet in the corner, its edges worn from years of use. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Henry's hand shot out, grabbing the nearest object, a small metal object he didn't quite recognize but didn't care to figure out in the moment. Without a second thought, he swung it at Charles, hitting the side of his head with a sickening thud. Charles staggered, his head snapping to the side from the impact. Blood trickled from his temple, his eyes wild with fury. He let out a low growl, wiping the blood from his face with the back of his hand. "You think you can stop me, Henry?" Charles spat, his voice barely above a growl. "You think I'm scared of a little pain?" Henry knew he couldn't keep up this game for long. He was growing weaker by the second, his body screaming for rest. But there was no time for rest. He had to keep fighting, keep pushing. The adrenaline was his only ally now. Charles, recovering quickly, lunged again, but this time, Henry was ready. As Charles's hand reached out to grab him, Henry twisted his body at the last second, using his momentum to propel himself into a roll. It was a desperate move, one that could have ended in disaster, but it worked. Charles's outstretched arm missed him entirely, and Henry found himself behind the man. Without wasting any time, Henry grabbed Charles's arm, using his weight to pull it back. Charles grunted in pain as Henry wrenched his arm behind his back. The knife fell to the floor with a clatter, but Henry wasn't finished. With a swift, calculated move, he swept Charles's feet out from under him, sending the man crashing to the ground. The sound of Charles hitting the floor was like thunder in the silence that followed. For a moment, Henry just stood there, panting, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His body felt as though it were made of lead, every inch of him sore and bruised. But there was no time to rest. Not yet. Charles was already starting to move again, his hands pushing against the floor as he tried to regain his footing. Henry had to end this, and fast. With a surge of strength, Henry grabbed the nearest object he could find, the metal soda can he had discarded earlier in the fight. His fingers gripped the cold metal as he swung it at Charles, hitting him hard across the side of his head. The can made a sickening crunching sound as it collided with Charles's skull, knocking him back into the wall. Charles slumped to the ground, dazed and unconscious. Henry stood over him, his chest still heaving, his body trembling from the exertion. He had done it. He had survived. But even as Charles lay motionless at his feet, Henry knew this wasn't over. There was still too much at stake, too many questions left unanswered. Charles might be down, but the shadows in the room told Henry that the battle was far from over. The room was eerily quiet, save for the sound of Henry's breath and the distant hum of the flickering light above. He took a cautious step back, his eyes scanning the darkness for any more threats. His hand was still tightly clenched around the metal can, his knuckles white from the pressure. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Henry could feel the full weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had fought through pain, exhaustion, and fear. But now, with Charles lying unconscious at his feet, there was still something gnawing at the back of his mind, a question he couldn't shake. How had it come to this? And who else was behind all of this madness? Henry slowly backed away from Charles's unconscious form, the questions swirling in his mind like a storm. He needed answers. He needed to figure out the rest of the pieces to this puzzle, or it would only be a matter of time before someone else came for him. With one last look at the defeated Charles, Henry turned and walked toward the door. Every step felt like an eternity, but he knew that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The real fight was just beginning. Henry stood in the dimly lit room, the weight of the gun cold in his trembling hand. His chest heaved with every breath, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't the young recruit who had first joined the force, wide-eyed and eager to please. No, tonight he had become something else, something darker. His fingers tightened around the pistol's grip as he leveled it at Charles, who was sprawled on the floor, struggling to rise, his face battered and bloodied. "Get up," Henry growled, his voice low, steady. Charles lifted his head, his eyes wild with defiance, though his body was shaking from the pain. "You think you've won, Henry? You think just because you've got me cornered, you've got control?" Henry's eyes narrowed. He could see the arrogance still clinging to Charles like a second skin, the belief that he could worm his way out of any situation. But this was different. Henry wasn't intimidated by the man anymore. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses," Henry said, his voice as cold as the steel in his hand. "I'm here to end this." Charles's lip curled into a sneer. "End it? You think you can just kill me and everything will be over? You're a fool." "You're the fool, Charles," Henry replied, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You were always the fool. Using hypnosis, manipulating people, turning friends into enemies. But it ends tonight." Charles's expression faltered for a moment, and Henry could see the fear creeping into his eyes. For the first time, Charles wasn't in control. The man who had orchestrated everything, who had played with lives like pawns on a chessboard, was now at the mercy of the very person he had underestimated. Henry took a step closer, the barrel of the gun unwavering. "You're not getting away with it this time." "Don't be so sure," Charles spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I have more people. More power than you know. You think you've won? Think again, Henry. You're just one man. What can you do? What can you really do against all of them?" Henry's jaw clenched, his mind racing. He knew Charles wasn't bluffing. The man had influence, resources, and a network of followers. But none of that mattered now. The game was over. There was only one way to end it. "I don't need an army," Henry said quietly, his eyes never leaving Charles. "I just need you to answer one question." Charles's eyes flickered, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. "What do you want, Henry? Why?" Henry's voice cracked, the weight of the question more than he had anticipated. "Why did you do it? Why kill Dora? Why frame Remy? Why ruin lives?" Charles laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that made Henry's skin crawl. "You wouldn't understand, Henry. You wouldn't understand what it's like to be overlooked, to be passed over. Cream was always the one. Always the golden boy. And Remy, don't even get me started on him. Always the perfect little detective. And Dora," Charles's voice wavered for the briefest moment, before he regained his composure. "Dora was a liability. She knew too much. She was too close to the truth." Henry felt a wave of disgust wash over him. "So you killed her? You killed her to keep your secrets safe?" Charles's lips curled into a twisted smile. "Yes. And I would have killed Remy too, if he hadn't gotten in the way. But now that you're here. Well, Henry, you're next." Henry's heart pounded in his chest, his hand steady on the gun as he aimed it directly at Charles. "You've already lost," he said, his voice low and final. "This ends now." For a long moment, the room was filled with only the sound of their breathing, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, Charles made a move. It was quick, desperate, a last-ditch attempt to grab a nearby weapon. But Henry was faster. He pulled the trigger without hesitation. The sound of the shot echoed through the room, a sharp, deafening crack that sent a shockwave through Henry's body. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He didn't even blink. He knew what he had to do. And in that instant, Charles crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Henry stared at the man who had orchestrated so much pain, so much suffering. And then, he exhaled slowly, his finger still on the trigger, but his hand now steady, his heart slow. It was over. Henry stood over Charles's lifeless body, the weight of the gun in his hand almost too much to bear. His body was still trembling, but not from fear or doubt. It was from the shock of what had just happened. He had ended it. He had stopped the madness. But at what cost? The room felt colder now, emptier, as though the final breath had been sucked out of it along with Charles's. Henry's mind drifted briefly to Dora, her face, her smile, her unwavering belief in justice. She had trusted him. And now, he had avenged her. The weight of that knowledge felt heavy in his chest, but he couldn't allow himself to linger in it. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the room behind him. He was done. The case was closed. And justice had been served.